everyone, Cadaver Kelly here, and welcome to my very first live stream. So I just want to make sure that this is all working. Can someone let me know in the chat if you can hear and see me all right? Someone let me know in the chat. Oh. All right. Thank you, Pumpkin Ghosts. Hey, Dry Shy, Caroline. Thank you both so much for modding. Thank you to all my friends who agreed to be moderators on this stream. We have a very interesting show for you tonight. I have a few guests, so we'll introduce them in a moment here. For tonight's live stream, we will be talking about indie music and hipsters and what their place is in the goth and alternative scene. So all my guests tonight will be goths and have experience with goth, underground, alternative music. All right, so without further ado, I would like to introduce my husband and co-host, Jim. He's going to give you a little bit of his background in underground music.
Hi. Yeah, so Kelly and I have been going to shows pretty much throughout the entirety of our relationship, through our marriage. I used to play in a post-punk band for about 5 years, 6 years, off and on. I got to know the local scene really well. I got to know our local independent music scene really well, which kind of will feed into this topic in general. I am a jazz drummer, interestingly enough. I was unable to find jazz bands to play in, and my interest in kind of the post-punk and alternative music scene just fed me into the music culture that as I went into higher education, I didn't have time to perform as much, so I started going out to shows more and being more active in our local scene. And when Kelly and I started dating, it kind of became one of the linchpins of just our relationship together. So I guess that's about the best as my introduction goes. If you regulate the channel, you've seen me in some of the reviews and things like that. And I'm also going to be modding the YouTube chat. So I'm excited to hear from all you.
All right, and our guest tonight, or our first guest, we do have a second guest that will be joining us later on in the show, is Jonathan. So I'm going to give Jonathan the chance to give a little bit of his background in alternative and underground music and share any creative projects or social media. So,
hi, my name is Jonathan. Yeah, I live in New York. With my I have been involved in underground music for at least the last 2 years. Chloe and I will also get Military Confessions, where we discussed being goth in the corporate environment. And yeah, so what I do primarily was I come from a very punk-based background in terms of my experience within the underground music scene and how it influenced me. And that led into hardcore, and then I was always kind of a goth. And then we moved forward in terms of our band projects that we were working on, hardcore, etc. I currently am working on, something kind of under the ground a little bit. Nothing to, really. I'm not trying to stir any water really, but we're doing another band by the name Dim. It's kind of a shoegaze kind of project. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I've been involved in underground music for 25 years, and been involved with projects that are considered to be either extreme in some way, whether it's black metal or techno, etc. So that's pretty much it. But yeah, I'm a pretty normal dude that lives with his wife in a house in Brooklyn and has 2 dogs and 2 cats.
All right. So just so everyone in the chat knows, we will, at the end of our discussion, take questions and comments from the chat, but we're just going to have a little bit of a discussion on indie and hipsters and a few different talking points before we do that. So first of all, what is indie? From my perspective, I've always used the term indie to describe bands or artists that are either on an independent record label or are financed and produced by the artists themselves. So I've always used it as shorthand for independent. I've never used the term indie to describe a particular sound. So from my perspective, a lot of goth and post-punk artists would fall into that indie category. But I've heard people use it almost to describe a sound or a number of different sounds. I've heard it used as almost like a genre label for folk, for soft rock, for pop. So I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on indie, how you use the word, your understanding of what the word indie means as it relates to music and media. So I'll start with Jonathan.
I have a pretty broad perspective on what the term means. I think that it's important to understand that from where I stand, independent labels such as I think I mentioned earlier, Deus and Sacred Bones, etc., those to me are independent labels. There was a time within the 90s where independent was different. I think you could actually look at and be surprised by the number of bands and labels that were not necessarily independent labels that were coming out of that time period, that were actually kind of a subsidiary of other larger labels. I think the one that comes to hand a little bit more focused is Trent Reznor's Nothing, was actually a part of Interscope. And if you look deeper, some of the other more darker center, and not even dark necessarily, but 4AD was an indie label. So I think that there are a number of labels. For me, indie, to distill this down to a moment, indie to me means not funded by outside resources, and really just a grassroots DIY perspective on moving forward and creating music and putting out bands and putting out records by bands that have the same philosophy.
Yeah, so I kind of have the same understanding as you do, Jonathan, with it being like independent labels. It's to me, indie describes more of the like how the music is financed and produced, and basically not being on a major label or produced by a large company or corporation. So that's been kind of my understanding. I think those were great examples. Deus Records is definitely a good modern example. 4AD was a good example. I would say that a lot of the record labels that produce modern day goth and post-punk are indie labels. So I'm not sure if Cleopatra Records would count as an independent label. I don't know how large of a scale they are as a company or a record label, but they certainly aren't on par with, like, you know, the Warner Brothers or Def Jam or some of those, you know, major record labels that you see constantly putting artists on the charts.
I think that that's an interesting topic, and actually, as influential as Cleopatra was to me, I don't know where they fell within that spectrum. I don't know that if during the 90s Cleopatra was sort of owned by someone else. I don't believe that they were. It's the same kind of thing as Wax Trax, right? So Wax Trax for all their everything, was a fairly fiercely independent label. And I feel bad for not having named Wax Trax. So Wax Trax is definitely up there.
Yeah, so I think I'll turn it over to Jim if you want to kind of like give a little bit of your perspective on how you think of the designation of indie music and media.
Sure. So I think I would maybe be one of the only people here to say that when I was introduced to the term indie as it relates to music, it was at the time probably like earlier 2000s, and I was hearing people refer to that as like some of more like the pop folkier music going around. But as my interest expanded and I got a little bit older, what I saw from the film industry and the games industry, it had a much more clear definition in that, as I think I would say, and Jonathan and Kelly are kind of saying now, that it relates to a sort of from the ground up development of some sort of entertainment media where you have this unfettered artistic vision that isn't affected by any sort of monetary interests of a larger entity that only has a real focus on what can be gained financially from this piece of entertainment medium, be it music, movies. You hear about it all the time in movies. At least a lot of people think of indie films as movies that do like the film festival circuit, but really they're often financed by the very people who have artistic stake in the film itself, be they an executive producer, director, what have you. Same thing with games, usually lead programmers, game directors. When you say an indie game, it means, you know, the people who have that artistic vision are the same people who are financing it out of their own pocket. And it's kind of come to mean that to me for music as well, especially as I took my musical training and started doing live shows. Indie music was no longer this this pop folk music. It wasn't the type of bands you would hear in a coffee shop. It was a band out there for their own financial gain. If they were tied to a label, they usually managed the label. And I think that's what indie music still means to me in a way. And it can vary. There's definitely some gray areas because there are smaller labels that take a very strong interest in the happiness of their musicians and any other performers they may have. But yeah, for me, when I hear indie, I do not think of a genre or a sound or almost even a subculture, unless it's the culture of these artists working together to have their visions unrestrained. And that's kind of where I'm at with it. And I think we'll go into that as we talk about hipsters and what we think of all that. Is this really a subculture in the way that we tend to define it? Is it a sound, or is it where that sound's coming from and how it's produced?
And that's an interesting point. I think we will kind of get into that more with like the hipster part of this discussion. But I think at this point, I do hear indie being almost like describing a genre at this point. And I've been told recently that if you look on Wikipedia, indie rock is listed as a genre, like a musicological genre. I don't think that there is a definitive indie sound, but when people are using the word indie in conversation, usually the context of the conversation, I know what they're talking about. Like I hear a lot of people make the distinction when talking about post-punk, the difference between goth post-punk and indie post-punk. Well, I think technically most post-punk is indie, it's as in it's independent music. But usually when people are distinguishing the two and they say indie post-punk in that context, they're usually talking about brighter sounding post-punk, more like the garage rock or glam rock or no wave kind of influence post-punk as opposed to the more goth or like cold wave, minimal wave, dark sounding post-punk. So it's interesting. And I've heard like kind of pop folk music be called indie before. I've heard soft rock. I've even heard like psychedelic bands. Like there's this band Django, and they're kind of like a psychedelic soft surf rock band. They've been called indie before. So I don't personally think there's a specific distinguishable sound that is associated with indie. I think it sounds like the three of us do kind of understand it as meaning kind of independently produced. And if JoJo is able to join the stream later on, we'll get her thoughts on this as well. But I think that's a good segue into getting into our discussion about hipsters. So this is a word I've heard thrown around a lot in the past 10 years, particularly. Maybe it's died down a little bit recently, but I hear the word get tossed around a lot, hipsters, and I use it too. We use it in conversation, but it seems to be a somewhat abstract concept. So I'm curious to hear how you guys use the word hipster, who you would describe as a hipster, or what your understanding of what that word means is. So I'll start with Jonathan.
Hi. Wow. Let's talk about a term that I hate more than any other term a lot of the times, unless it's an actual racist or, just generally derogatory epithet towards any individual. I conceptually understand the idea of what it means to be labeled as a hipster. I think that if I go back to a certain conversation that I had in a tour van driving back from Toledo, Ohio, after a show, and we talked with my guitar player in the band that I was playing at the time to discuss what we just defined as the commodification of cool. I think that is what hipsterism is. So to me, the term hipster has moved from, even in the last 10 years, to a term that was maybe not necessarily derogatory to an absolutely derogatory term, wherein it's simply how corporate America takes ideas and distills them into something that they can sell. That is my take on hipsterism. I think that having lived in the community that I live in, which is Brooklyn, New York, for the past almost 12 years, I have been at the center of what would be considered hipsterism, because I lived in 8 years in Williamsburg, and then I now live in South Brooklyn, which is a very not Williamsburgish neighborhood, but at the same time, I still have that sort of DNA a little bit, to the point where I think that to answer your question, or to really elucidate a little bit more, I think that hipster as a term, it just needs to go away. It really is just how corporate America commodifies an idea and sells it back to people in other communities. They're just taking ideas and selling it, and that's pretty much it.
I think that's a really interesting point that it almost is like thrown around like a marketing term, where you hear the word hipster thrown around a lot. And usually it's ascribed to the millennial generation. I do think that in some ways it could be used to disparage people within the millennial age group. I mean, I've seen the word used in both positive and negative connotations. In conversation, when I use the word hipster, I'm usually using it to describe someone who is maybe kind of generally alternative in some way, but doesn't have a strong kind of like subcultural affiliation. Like if I know someone's a punk and they, seem very punk, like their music tastes, the way they look, then I would probably call them a punk. Same thing with goths or, metalheads, rivet heads. But if someone's a more kind of general alternative where you can't really pinpoint what their scene is or what their subcultural affiliation is, I definitely use the term hipster in that context. And I agree with you. I'm not a huge fan of the word. It's usually in conversation, if you say the word hipster, it conjures an image. People have an image in their mind, but I've seen people use the word hipster to describe a lot of different groups. I've seen it used to describe people who are into kind of like 90s grunge stuff. I've seen it to describe people who are women who are maybe kind of like the Riot Girls of the 90s, where they have like the funky colored hair and body modifications, but maybe they dress in clothes that are more that thrift store kind of like granny librarian chic. Like I've seen just so many different kinds of people, and I've been called a hipster before too. I think basically any person in today's day and age who has any sort of like alternative vibe is at risk of being labeled a hipster at some point in conversation. So Jim, what are your thoughts on what a hipster is?
Well, we've obviously talked about this in person, but my opinion, just being forthright with it, I'm not sure that that's a thing that really exists. I could hear it argued as perhaps some kind of marketing term. That's honestly not something I truly considered, in the same way that when we use things like millennial boomer, things like that, a lot of these things kind of got power and traction as marketing terms. But the real thing about it is, when I think of hipster, and you could say this to a lot of things that a lot of people would claim are subcultures or movements, but I always think of the theory of forms, which I think is like Plato. And basically the idea is that when you try to describe something as its absolute form, maybe it's a chair, where you say, oh, well, what is a chair? Tell me what the absolute form of a chair is. You say it has four legs. Not all chairs have four legs. You sit on it. Well, not all things you sit on are a chair. And it just goes on, and you prove that you can't really definitively describe this thing. And when it comes to hipsters, one thing that I think has been consistent, or the only thing that's been consistent across the term's use, is that nobody can really agree on what those are. I just calling some things I saw in the chat, vaping. Somebody would say hipsters vape. A lot of people would say, oh, hipsters don't smoke, or hipsters do drugs, or hipsters are clean living. They eat only organic. And there's all these different ideas floating around. A lot of them are contradictory, and there doesn't seem to be this sort of mass idea of what it truly means to be hipster. A lot of people say, oh, well, they listen to only obscure bands. That is a hipster. Or they listen to popular bands, but they listen to them ironically. And I think that's where this idea of it being a derogatory term came about. Is it was associated with a sort of disingenuous liking of something, or a disingenuous liking of something. They do all these things ironically. It's not true to their actual beliefs or what they think is good. And that's where it brings me around again to, I just can't say for sure that this is a thing that exists. I've never run into somebody personally who would describe themselves as a hipster, even though I'm sure there's some people out there who might, but I don't think those people would be in the vast majority. These are not a group of people that accumulate together over common causes, ideas, because people seemingly can't agree on what it means in the first place. And some of that can be said with things in, like we talk about goth a lot, but goth, you have things that you see a lot. You see, a lot of people are bounded together over the music. A lot of people are bounded together over the other interests that come out of the subculture itself. But these people get together. They have events. They have talks. And to me, I've never been able to see any sort of actual hipster community. And that's where I call into question, is this a thing that exists, or is this a thing that we use to refer to somebody that we don't exactly understand or identify with? And that's about my 2 cents.
I think that's a good point. I do think, obviously the word has at least some surface level meaning because people use it a lot. But I do think that maybe it's more like an abstract concept, or like Jonathan mentioned, kind of this way that kind of like corporations or those out to commercialize on trends kind of jump in and try to box in a demographic. But you mentioned the chat. I think this would be a good point to maybe respond to some of the things in the chat, or I see people in the chat talking about what their concept of a hipster is. So I think it'd be interesting to maybe respond to some of those. So Caroline said, when I first heard hipster, it was definitely the liked it before it was cool thing. Fuck mainstream and kind of retro. Now it's almost mainstream. It's these vegan lumberjacks collecting vinyl. So I think those are definitely a lot of the classic stereotypes that come to mind when someone uses the word hipster. I liked it before it was cool. And again, these are kind of like, these ideas are a little more disparaging.
Well, as a vegan that cut wood today, I will. I guess whatever. I guess I'm a hipster.
I've been called a hipster before, so. So anthropomantic fiend said, a lot of my friends would probably be classified by hipster the way you classify them, Kelly. I just call them cool people. And again, that's interesting. There's a positive connotation, kind of like this. It's, Jonathan mentioned like kind of commodifying cool. Some people would say it's cool. Some people would say that hipsters are, kind of like irritating. I've heard both in goth spaces. In goth spaces, when I hear goths talk about hipsters at the club, I've heard people complain about it, and I've heard people praise so-called hipsters being at the club because, well, more people at the club, the better, keeps the nights alive. But I've also heard people complain about it. And I think in that context, maybe people are talking about someone at a goth club that maybe they don't think is a goth. But then again, if they're at the club and they're supporting the event and they're interacting with people, that's a whole other discussion on what makes a goth. But I think that's what people are talking about in that context with hipsters at the goth club. It's people at the goth club that don't fit their idea of what a goth is.
I would totally agree with you, Kelly. I think that's a huge thing. And I remember when I first started going to goth, and I'm a little bit older, but when I first started going to goth clubs and first started exploring that avenue when I was in 1996, 95, 96, the people that were reaching out to me and being close to me within the community and being nice and being welcoming within those communities, those are the people that I'm still friends with. And I think that's something we often forget about within our sub-communities, is that we have to remember that not everyone is, submersed in the entire culture, and they might want to explore. When I was coming up, goth was kind of the last common denominator. That's where you went when you couldn't go anywhere else. And you were always accepted, and you were always accepted without any sort of complication. You were just made to be a friend. And I think that's one of the things I fondly remember about goth, and one of the things that I tried to inject in terms of when I moved forward in my in playing bands in the punk and hardcore community, was there's still a lot of politicking and a lot of nastiness within those communities. But I always remembered that if you're going to those shows, that there's a reason for it, and everyone should be welcomed and celebrated and accepted for being there. And it's about creating a more accepting community, and that's what I think goth should be, in my opinion. Not to soapbox anything, just saying.
Yeah. So I lost. There was a comment I was going to respond to. RC Scott said, I also got hipster because I vape. That's interesting about vaping being associated with hipsters. I'm not sure if I would have thought about that one. But Jim, I think you had mentioned that, right? Or you said that someone in the chat said vaping as like a.
Yeah, that was a little bit higher up. You may not be able to. There's not even time stamps or a comment saying indie. It's interesting. At least when I was growing up, they seemed a little more relevant. They were definitely, they kind of started as a punk band, but they almost immediately, at least what the punk fans thought, is they sold out and went for a more radio-friendly sound. That's just what I've heard. I do not have a strong horse in the race as far as the Goo Goo Dolls go, but yeah, it kind of feeds back into this idea of what exactly does all this mean. And as far as what Jonathan was saying, is it does seem to be a kind of broad stroke to be painting over these communities of people who have been around really a long time, and each of themselves could be, I think, categorized differently, and they all really predate that label. It seems like the label came about and kind of just got stretched over all these groups of people who really were doing something different. It seems like it almost comes from a place of unfamiliarity with the subcultures that people are looking at and trying to categorize. And that makes sense. It's understandable that if you're not really active in what we would kind of see as the larger alternative community, that these different kinds of people would maybe blur together a little bit. But another comment I saw in the chat that we almost assuredly lost is that, well, maybe I lost it.
Hold that thought, Jim. It looks like Jojo just joined in. So
yeah, sorry, we were trying to.
I wanted to add Jojo to the stream and give her a chance to introduce herself. So Jojo, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background with goth and alternative underground music, and if there's any projects you're working on that you'd like to share, or social media.
Of course. Can you listen to me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Amazing. I'm Jojo. I'm from actually Puerto Rico. I didn't know nothing about goth music until it was 2002 or 3 or 5, in which I've heard a DJ Ferret compilation that used to include Paralyzed Age. At the moment, I did knew about Sister of Mercy, but I took their word from granted. They were not goth for me because they used to say so. My background actually is classical music and music theory, and that's about it. I fell in love with the combination and fusion of sound that inquires classical and dark and atmospheric. That's basically it. At the moment, I'm looking forward to have a band. So let's see how it goes.
Yeah, that'll be awesome. And I see you got your mask to protect against the virus.
Yeah.
So Jojo is actually a contributing writer for Obscura Undead. I recently joined on as a writer for Obscura Undead as well. So just wanted to throw that out there. If you want to read some pieces written by Jojo, go to obscuraundead.com. So
Thank you very much.
We talked a little bit about indie music, and the three of us kind of agreed generally on our idea of what indie music means, and that rather than being a particular sound, that indie music would be music that's on an independent record label or financed and produced by the artist, more about like how it's like produced and financed, not being on a major record label. But I have heard people call a number of different sounds or genres indie, or use the word indie to describe sounds. So I wanted to hear your take on it, Jojo. What are your thoughts on indie music and what the word indie means as it pertains to music? Oh, are you able to hear us? All right, we may have lost Jojo. Jojo, can you hear us?
I'm
I don't know
sorry, I
if it's
couldn't hear you
related, but
guys.
I'm
It
having
seems that a
latency
call
issues
came
here
in.
too.
Guys, can you stop calling, guys? Go to the chat.
Oh,
Oh, it's not working.
hi, RC Scott. So, all right. We'll jump into some more comments in the chat here. Kind of going back through, jumping around the chat. And Arthur Frost said, in my area, hipster is more or less what someone is called based on a clothing style involving neck beards and flannel who listen to exclusively college bands. So I'm wondering if he means like bands that are in college or like play on college campuses. I assume that's what he means by college bands. Yeah, that kind of goes along with what I was saying with the 90s influence. I've seen people who maybe look like they're out of the 90s, like the grunge era or the Riot Grrrl era. I see people that kind of embody that general aesthetic or interests as being labeled hipsters.
Well, I think it's important to recognize the idea that college radio used to be an important thing, right? Like before the age we live in now, when we had the access to music that we have, college radio was a really important function of learning new music and getting access to new music. So I think that it's a little bit, it's disingenuous to say it's about college bands or college areas, because college radio stations during that time in the 90s were really, really important for getting access to being able to hear new music and bands getting able to put out new sounds. So I think, I understand what he's saying, but I don't think that's accurate. I think there is something missing with that right now. I think it's been replaced with like your SoundCloud and your Bandcamps, etc. But college radio was a very, very vital function of being able to hear not only goth music, but pretty much all indie music at that point in time. So I think that if you even go back to where I grew up in Ohio, and you look at the movie Rain Man and the experience that he has where he keeps repeating the name of the college rock radio station from Miami, Ohio. Miami, Ohio was a very conservative area, but they had this really, really amazing station. So yes and no. I think that it's disingenuous to say that it's associated with college radio and flannel. I think that's not fair to a lot of sort of avenues that are trying to get people access and to kind of boost the signal of folks that are trying to learn about new music. To say that those are, associated with a certain sort of hipster mentality, and I hate using that term again, but I think that's disingenuous.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from with that. And it's kind of similar to the discussion that we had on indie earlier, where we were kind of saying that, like, it's like independently produced and stuff like that. College radio, we have, and, there was a radio station at the college I went to as well. We also have a nonprofit radio station here in Pittsburgh that I would say is probably similar to what you're describing. We're playing a lot of like independent or local bands, not kind of like major label or bands that wouldn't be very easily accessible otherwise. I mean, I think in today's day and age, we have the internet, we have SoundCloud, we have all these streaming services that make it a lot easier to access these bands and to hear independently produced music. Looks like JoJo's. Hey, JoJo, you're back.
Yes, I am. Right now, I'm in the bus.
All right,
Let's
so
go
we
home
were
together.
We were just talking about indie music and college radio, but I wanted to get your thoughts on indie music and what the word indie means to you as it pertains to music. I think the three of us were kind of we were talking about like independent record labels and artists that are kind of like self-financed and produced. But I've heard people use it to describe certain sounds. I've heard people use the word indie to describe folk, pop, soft rock, all kinds of different sounds of music. But what's your understanding of indie music?
Well, my understanding of indie actually means for independent artists of any kind, every artist, oil painters, graphic designers, any artist who cost themselves to produce themselves their own piece of art called indie. That's why they are independent. Most of them really, and these kind of people really enjoy what they do. Most of the time, indie artists create such an impressive form of things that they are not able to be labelized. They are not being able to be labeled through a label. I've seen cases in which bands, independent bands of any kind, they do amazing until they get a label. So it depends, you know. Independent artists mean that, you know, they produce themselves, they cost themselves, they double effort. They not necessarily go through a contract to express themselves. Basically, that's it.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point that it might be more difficult to genretize independently produced artists because they do have complete creative freedom if they are financing and producing their own music, or oftentimes even if they are on an independent, smaller record label, they'll have a lot more creative freedom. I think it'd be hard to ascribe one single sound to indie. There's so much independent music, and it usually is more open creatively and experimental.
Sure. I've seen bands in Bandcamp actually that they sound really post-punk or really dark wave, but since they label it's all about other genres, they are labelized as the genre that the label imposed them. So there's a lot of people who get confused because basically the label that appears is not the same or accurate to their sound, and it makes it hard for people who want to look for new music. So, on the other hand, there's a lot of labels like Cleopatra that allow certain things, certain freedom, because they are meant to do that. No, they are targeted to certain people.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. We had talked a little bit about Cleopatra earlier in the stream, whether they would be considered an independent label. I think so. I don't think Cleopatra would meet the criteria of being a major record label. I just think from a sales perspective, the size of the company, what kind of financial backing they have, Cleopatra is an independent label, I would assume. And we were talking about Dias Records. There's a lot of great independent record labels out there right now. Here in Pittsburgh, we have Play Alone Records. They're a local post-punk record label. There's Cold Transmission. Out of Poland, you have Batcave Productions. There's countless. There's too many to name. Currently, great independent record labels that produce music that would be fitting for a goth club or the post-punk scene. So the idea of indie as a genre or as a sound, so I usually know what people mean when they say indie music, if they're describing a genre sound, like just given the context of the conversation, but it really is more of a designation, I think, of how the music is financed, how it's produced. So Jojo, another point or another topic we were talking about was hipsters. So how would you describe a hipster?
Wow. An arrogant? No, just kidding. Basically, what I know about hipsters is that they are glam nerds, glamified version of nerds. They are worms from libraries, library worms. Is that how you name it?
Oh, library, like bookworms. Yeah, that kind of like came up as a discussion point. Yeah, we were.
I don't know. Maybe I'm so cute.
Yeah, we were kind of talking about. I don't think there's a definitive, like, kind of cohesive idea of what a hipster is. And we were talking about this concept of hipsters being something kind of, or being a concept made by corporations for, you know, commodification and selling products. But we were definitely getting some hipster stereotypes from the chat, and I think we'll probably return to doing that. We saw vaping was one of the hipster stereotypes. Flannel, lumberjack was another one I saw. So I'm trying to scroll back here and see. So Pumpkin Ghost said, what about the e-girl and e-boy stuff? Sometimes when something is not a part of the norm, people label things as that. I actually don't know that much about this whole e-girl, e-boy thing. I've seen some like YouTube videos pop up about it, but or like Jim, was that you laughing? Oh
yeah, sorry.
You kind of froze up, but I've seen like the whole idea of like e-boys, e-girls, or visco girls. Are they the same thing? They might be different. I don't know. Jim, do you know anything about this?
I'm gonna pass. I've seen the jokes, the memes. Yeah, I'm gonna slide that back to you. I'm good on that one. I'm certainly not an authority.
All right. So I think another good way to kind of like frame this question: how do you see other people using the term hipster? Like how, like, could you describe like maybe qualities or characteristics about a person that you would see other people, like, you know, throwing the word hipster at? So I'll start with Jonathan on this one.
Wow. I think that it's gotten really, really, really broad. I think that facial, like you said, facial hair and flannels and this, that, and the other. I think that you know, my wife and I often get labeled, and I got, and I'll just put out a personal story. We make our own almond milk at home, and you know, we got called hipsters because we make our own almond milk. I think that there is, and to that end, I don't think that there is now anyone disseminating thing that I can speak to that says this is a hipster. I was watching, I can't remember what show it was, but the whole handlebar mustache, kind of pastel colors, wearing, you know, pastel Vans. It's just there's no definitive thing that defines what being a hipster is anymore. You could easily call me a hipster at this point, just because I look the way that I am and I live where I do, and I do not feel like I'm any cooler than anyone else. And so I don't think that there is really any. I think it's, honestly, if I'm being completely transparent, I think it's a lost term. I think it's a term that's lost all meaning at this point in the scope of its sort of wherever it's going to go.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I kind of agree with that myself. I do think that in some ways it's meaningless. Like I said, there's got to be like some surface level meaning that people use it in conversation a lot, but I think it's not something with really any sort of like significant meaning. I kind of mentioned before we jumped on the stream, kind of like the yuppies in the 80s, young urban professionals. It was kind of like this term that was used to describe this era of kind of like 20 and 30 somethings who were like working professionals, like living in cities, kind of like straight laced, like kind of I don't know what you call like maybe preppy or yeah, I guess preppy. It was another abstract concept like that was kind of like put onto a similar demographic. And even though the image that it conjures up seems completely opposite to the image that the word hipster would conjure up, I think it described pretty much a similar like demographic of usually young 20 and 30 something upper middle class people who move into the city. I think there's like this concept of like gentrification that comes along with both of those groups and both of those designations. Again, both are kind of abstract concepts. I don't think people in the 80s were really self-identifying as yuppies that much. Same way like where the people I know who might get called hipsters frequently would not designate themselves as a hipster. So that's kind of the way I see it, is it's this very like abstract concept, not really having very significant meaning. Jim, what are your thoughts on that? How have you seen like other people use the word hipster?
Well, I think all of us have been called that at one point or another for varying reasons. As somebody brought up in the chat just now, that I think was an interesting point and kind of brings up my feelings on it, is it seems to be used to a certain extent to, it always seems pretentious. That seems to be like a constant through line that keeps coming up, to the extent that I've heard them used interchangeably. If somebody is pretentious about something they like, then they're a hipster about it, or they're a hipster about this specific thing. And it goes back to, well, if they're pretentious about something, is that something they ironically like? Because that's the other thing I hear, is this is I ironically like this thing. That's a thing that hipsters do, or that is a hipster attitude. And I don't think somebody who is pretentious and likes something ironically is something you would commonly find used together. So I hear it used in place of pretentious. I hear it used in place of all sorts of other things. And there is a certain visual style that I think conjures this up, but I don't think that you could describe those people as being, nobody thinks of hipster as exclusively a fashion thing. There's always all sorts of other components. And I don't think it's fair to even whittle it down to a fraction thing either, because somebody said earlier, flannel and beards. Okay, my dad has like flannel and has had a beard before, but he's not a guy that I would describe as a hipster, just because of, maybe it's a generational thing. It certainly seems to be used dominantly towards people in the millennial or younger age range, which is strange too, because I'm not sure that people in younger generations would even understand now like what that is. It's really odd. I'm not sure if I could really point out one consistent thing that it's been used in conjunction with.
Again, I think that kind of circles back to my thoughts that maybe this term hipster is thrown out sometimes to disparage younger people, or to maybe project negative thoughts or ideas or assumptions about younger people onto them. Like someone sees, like younger people out and about, maybe they don't, maybe they have like more eclectic aesthetics or something like that, and they project these ideas about like, oh, pretentiousness or like disingenuous irony, like things like that, like these kind of like negative ideas and connotations. And I'm wondering if there is maybe sort of like, I kind of compared it to the yuppies in the 80s. Maybe it is sort of like every generation gets a little bit of flack from the older generations, and this might be another way that millennials and Gen Zers are taking flack from generations before them. So I think there's just it is so abstract, and there's like a lot to unpack. Jojo, any thoughts on any of that?
Well, I just can relate to my hometown and the people in my hometown, Puerto Rico. I had conversations with my parents back then when I was a teenager, when I was looking for identity, right? Um, they used to say that they used to hate being labeled. They used to hate labels, and they used to say, well, I hear this kind of music, and that's it, right? But don't you dare telling them that they are hipsters or whatever label, because they don't do that. Nowadays, I find that this generation is looking for it. It's looking for a label specifically. And this one of hipster, I do remember that during a certain amount of time, early 2000s, 2005, 2007, the hipster term in Puerto Rico was kind of good, better than the average. Um, Now it's kind of bullying or something. So it's interesting the way things change according to the generation, the circumstances, what an influencer can do online with the label. So there's too much things going on. So yeah, I think James right about the generations according to the label, specifically with hipster. Yeah, with hipster.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about previous generations being very adverse to labels and being very like against being labeled. And now it does seem like people embrace labels, or they're almost searching for that. I actually just read a book about Riot Girl in the 90s, which I'm going to review at some point here. But and Kathleen Hanna said at one point that she left Riot Girl, or kind of like distanced herself from the Riot Girl movement, because it became less about the experiences of these young women and more about identity, and like trying to focus in on identity and being able to kind of like box up and sell the idea of like, kind of this cut and paste identification for a person. So that's kind of like an interesting concept. And I don't know, I think anyone who might fit what would be the stereotype criteria for a hipster, and whatever that may be, we've heard some of those stereotypes in the chat. But I don't think a lot of those people would actually call themselves a hipster. So the fact that we kind of like establish that, we don't think that there is really a significant meaning behind hipster or what a hipster is. I did kind of have some points about like, oh, do you feel that like you have hipsters in your local like goth and alternative scene? Well, I mean, for me, I would say no, but we do have an eclectic mix of people that other people might label as hipsters in our scene. So I'm curious to hear from the rest of the group about that, about, do you have this like kind of eclectic mix of people? Do you see people in your local scene who others might describe as a hipster? So I'll throw it back to Jonathan to start us off.
Hi. One, I want to say, I think one of the things we're talking about when we talk about hipsters, and I think this has been particularly relevant to my neighborhood. I live in South Brooklyn after 8 years of living in Williamsburg, and houses and communities are getting knocked down because what people consider hipsters are moving into town. There's buildings being built that are cookie cutter sort of apartment buildings that are, I mean, what I'm essentially getting to is that I am part of the problem at some point in this conversation. And while I don't consider myself a hipster, I do recognize that me having moved into a Haitian and Jamaican community has, on some level, accelerated the level of progress. I'm not going to call it progress.
Gentrification.
Yeah, it's just not good. And I do feel a personal sort of association with that. What was your other question? I'm sorry, Kelly. I'm sorry.
Oh, it was kind of, do you see people who might be, others might describe as hipsters or might fit some of these stereotypes in the chat? Like, do you see people like that in your local scene? Like in your local, like goth or like at the goth club or goth or alternative events? Oh, I think Jonathan froze up. All right, so I'll turn the question to you, JoJo.
All right, I'm
You're
back.
back. Okay, so go ahead, Jonathan.
I was going to say, yeah, absolutely, yes. There's a strong sense of trying to create a community within New York. And when I moved here, I was DJing at a night at a bar called P&M, and it was a post-punk night called No Soul, and it was doing really, really well. But now it seems like you would expect that when you get to New York, you would expect there would be like this really vibrant scene. Really?
Oh, Jonathan, we lost you again.
I'm glad it's not just on my end. But,
All right, I'm back again. Sorry.
Okay.
I would say I think that there are far fewer people that would fall into what would categorically be considered hipsters now. I don't see it. I don't really see it anywhere. I just see people being people and going about their daily lives and being like interesting folks. And I think the really kind of grain of what was considered hipsterism, however you want to define that, I think has definitely ebbed to the point that it's never coming back. And it's really just more about connecting with people and being, if people are a part of other subcultures, that's fine. Charlotte. But yeah, I don't see that in New York anymore. I think the concept of being a hipster is kind of dead here. I think that there's almost this overarching zeitgeist that if you live here, you are a hipster, but that's not really the case.
Is Charlotte a hipster?
Charlotte is a giant pit bull who has no idea how big she is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'll let JoJo kind of answer. And JoJo, you're down in Orlando, correct? So do you ever see like what maybe other people would describe as a hipster or like hipsters at your local goth club or in your local scene?
But yeah, I think normal people I think normal people that young people dress up. I think people that on their daily basis dress like.
Hey JoJo, we're having a hard time hearing you. Could you like speak into the mic? I don't know if it's what's going on.
No. Testing.
Oh,
102.
better. Yeah, that's much better.
Oh, right. So I was saying that I've seen all kinds of people going to nightclubs to enjoy a real goth night. I've seen normies that take the chance to dress up. I've seen people, and I know people that on their daily basis they act and do and feel, and I guess they aren't hipsters, but when they go to a goth night, we enjoy everyone and everything as it is. We don't care if you are even a hip hopper. The only thing we care is that you go there, enjoy the music, and have a good time. So yeah, I've seen hipsters there, but I haven't seen a problem with it. You know?
Yeah, I feel the same way. We have a pretty eclectic mix of people at our local clubs, and definitely people who I think others would describe as hipsters. I wouldn't describe anyone really as a hipster, but we have people who dress more like they're like coming out of like the 90s Seattle grunge scene. We have people who are dressed like a little more like they're punks. We have people who look like they are straight out of a 70s glam rock band. Like we have a very eclectic mix of people that show up to the goth club. And I think that all of them, like I'm so thankful for all of them, but because they are the reason we have these events. Because I mean, if I go to the club, even if it's like goth friendly music, there might be 5 goths in the room and 30 people of other types of alternative variety or just kind of like generally artistic or creative leaning people. So I'm sure other people would describe some of them as hipsters, but I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to have an eclectic mix of people in an alternative music scene, because I think it helps turnout. I think wanting for like goth or punk events to be like all goths or all punks, or kind of have like more of this kind of monolithic presence is, I don't know, and that the idea of that almost seems less fun, less interesting. But I think we have this great ability to market our local events around here, like local shows, clubs, to a wide variety of people, and I think that helps make them viable. So I mean, Jim, you're here in the same scene as me, but do you have any different thoughts on that? Oh.
Was that for James or for me?
Jim, you're on mute.
I said, I'm sorry. Could you reiterate that last point? I was trying to fix my audio issues.
Oh, I was talking about how we have kind of like an eclectic mix of people here, and I think that's a good thing. I think it makes our events viable. I like to see kind of like a variety of different types of people in our local scene. I don't know if you want to add any kind of like additional light onto that.
It definitely varies based on who seems to be organizing events. And like I said, we saw something a little bit different down in Florida. There was like this Common Core group that we saw out at all the events, and that was a lot of fun. It was really great. But up here, it's like we have one that we go to often, Second Skin, and we know in going to Second Skin that the groups you see there are going to be a little bit more varied. Not everybody is going to be dressed maybe as pointedly as me and Kelly are now, but in other ways, it's nice to see interest in the music in audiences that you wouldn't always see going out to these events. Obviously, as members of the subculture, we want to see it succeed, and we want to see it reach as many varieties of people with as many backgrounds as possible. So it's kind of strange. I'm happy to see like all our familiar faces. I'm happy to see people who definitely kind of fit in what we call like our goth group, but I also really like seeing people I wouldn't expect at events. And that's one of the things I really like about our local scene, is that people around here seem to be really, really open to going to different kinds of events, kind of not concerned whatsoever about who they think should be going to those events. And maybe that's more just because we have a couple of colleges nearby, and we have like younger groups who are just out to go out and see or try anything. But either way, yeah, I really like seeing I guess you would say some of them would fit the visual stereotype of what you would call a hipster, but that's not really how I'd refer to them unless I was being facetious. But yeah, it's nice to see anybody from any background at our events.
Oh, Jojo, yeah, you can absolutely smoke a cigarette on the live stream if you want.
You're gonna have to poke a hole in your mask.
Yeah, but let me see how I can take this off. It's too tight. Yeah, I'm gonna smoke a cigarette. So I'm so happy that I could even find a community in Florida because in Puerto Rico, it's really hard. There used to be in my hometown. Hello, hi. There used to be like a community there for. Let me see if you can listen to me. Technical issues. Hello, can you listen?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. So I'm so happy I could even find a community here in which I could share my thoughts and feelings and the music I used to like and like till this day. Because back in Puerto Rico, they're almost dead. There used to be one. I wasn't able to enjoy it because I was a minor back then and I wasn't brave enough to get a fake ID. So I didn't have the opportunity to share those lives and to learn more about it. So yeah, it's a privilege to have a place in which everyone can gather, despite if you're a hipster or not. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I completely
I know that back then there was like this kind of philosophy of gatekeeping in a way that you can sit with us if you were not whatever. And maybe he's still around. Maybe there are people like that still today, still today. But at the same time, I feel so happy every time I went to a nightclub and I see new people and being happy. People that they couldn't go when they were teenagers, and now I'm looking at them, all grown up, going into the nightclub and dancing, and I really like that.
That's extremely important from a youth subculture perspective. To see people that identify with the way that you think, the way that you are, the music you listen to. That was what always was so important to me about goth and punk rock in general. Was like, I don't fit in, but here's a group of people that I fit in with. And even if someone has slightly different ideas than I do, if you come here, you're accepted. That's what it was. That's the point. That's what goth was to me. Like, if you're here, it doesn't matter if you have wrong ideas. Fine, we'll talk about it. But it opens up the opportunity for a conversation. And I know this is kind of off topic, but I think that that's kind of what building a community is. And especially when you get into goth and punk rock, that's like what's important.
Yeah, and I think with goth and punk or like really any small niche kind of like music or art scene, just showing up is a huge contribution, I think, and an important one, because these are kind of usually small niche events. These are not going to be events, like these shows aren't going to be packing stadiums. The clubs aren't going to be, the clubs that make tens of thousands of dollars in a night. So just showing up is a huge contribution, and I think it really helps out the community. So, and in my opinion, yeah, if someone just shows up, I think that's so important.
It is, and nobody knows how important it is for a local manager to see that the event that they allow to produce, they are getting people in there, they are circulating, they are consuming, they are buying, it inspires more administrators, is that the word? I'm sorry, I'm not so good with English. But it helps, managers from locals to have to give us more opportunities to create more events. And that is really important because basically there's no other way to spread the voice and spread these artists, especially independent artists, than the people themselves, going to these kind of events despite of whatever you feel like to actually be there. showing up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think we can maybe take some like questions or comments from the chat.
Yeah,
Let's see.
that's just a lot of questions.
Okay, so this comment says my partner is not goth, but he enjoys some of the music, so he comes with me to events, and nobody has ever said a word just because he is dressed in corduroy and nerd shirts. And that's how my local scene is too. Everyone's welcome. Yeah.
We've definitely had some friends that seemed tentative to come with us to events just because that's a big part of what we do for fun. And they say like, I don't really want to have to dress up or do anything I'm not comfortable with. And it's like, we are maybe in 50% or less that actually dress any particular way for a lot of these events. Some of these people might have just wandered in from a bar across the street. And Jojo made a great point. That's something I wasn't even considering, is it's almost not even really right or proper to feel too strongly about how the majority of people showing up to your community's events are dressed or how they look or who they are, because that's a large part of what makes these events possible. And that's the same thing we try to convey to a lot of our friends who are coming in. It's like, if you're just there, you're no more or less than any of the rest of us.
Yeah, so
You
here's
don't know how happy a DJ might feel when they see a normie asking, what song is this? I like it. It's actually fulfilling.
yeah, it's
it feels
exciting.
great.
When one of my like non-goth friends or like non-alternative friends like asks to like hear a goth band, or they ask what goth music sounds like, or like I show them some music, whether it's like goth or punk or whatever, and they like it, it's like the best feeling in the world. Introducing people to like the music I love and them actually liking it, it's like one of the best feelings ever.
Yes, it is. Yes.
So this one's kind of a little bit of a different perspective. So-called alt clubs are in the UK are losing the alt. So I think that's what, when people complain about hipsters in the club, or they say like, there's hipsters at the goth club, I'm not like a fan of all these hipsters here. I think that might be part of what they're worrying about too. They're worrying that their favorite club might become less and less goth, or maybe try to like cater to like non-goth crowds. And I think that is a legitimate concern. I think it's going to be more in the like kind of culture and environment. Are these people that maybe don't look like goths, or maybe aren't goths, that are showing up to the club, are they kind of like respecting the territory, respecting like the music and the people who kind of like put these events together in the first place? Or do they want these events to be more catered to their interests? So I do think there is kind of a balance there.
Definitely. I mean, speaking about business, right? When you start to make people feel uncomfortable, they should stop wanting to contribute. So it's very dangerous. I know we need to keep a tradition because goth is goth because of it. But at the same time, if someone is curious, if someone is here because they enjoy the song or something like that, we shouldn't treat them like they shouldn't belong. Or if they want to belong, we have to be open to show them if they want to. If they even don't want to, but they do enjoy the music, like the enthusiasts, well, we should, because that's the way we can gather more contributions.
Yeah, I do think it's a fine balance between being welcoming in goth and alternative spaces to people who maybe aren't, the typical goth or alternative person, but also not getting to the point where you're catering to like a broader audience so much that you are alienating the original goth and alternative crowd. I think there is a balance there. Because I have heard people tell me stories of, their favorite goth club back in the 90s or whatever started playing more and more like house music, and then into actual like pop music, and then like suddenly this club just expanded to become like a top 40s club. So I have heard those stories as well. But I don't think it's like one or the other. I don't think it's like two extremes, like either we need to box our clubs into like only the people who belong here, or we have to keep everyone happy. I don't think it's like it has to be one of those two extremes. I think you can find a balance, like a happy balance.
That's important. Yeah, right. That's a delicate, a fine line when you have people that listen to other kind of music into this nightclub that, we need to say it, they consume more than the people who are there listening to us. So the administration takes the decision to play more music that attracts people that consumes more. So it's a very delicate line, in other hands, we do appreciate a lot when we can find a place in which, I'm going to a goth club and I'm going to listen to goth music, and I feel comfortable there, and I'm happy and I'm glad, and I will consume there because, contribution. I think it's a matter of contribution much more than, the music you play in the nightclub itself. Like places, well, I can say the castle, they have divided sections in which they play different kind of music for different kind of people, cybergoth in EDM and whatnot, and the patio and divided nights to make people to have a balance.
Yeah, I think
you'll never listen to hip hop on a castle, I guess.
Yeah, I think the castle actually pulls that off beautifully. How the castle in Tampa, Florida, for anyone who isn't familiar with the castle, it's like kind of like a goth industrial or alternative nightclub in Tampa. It's really cool that they have a dedicated club for that. And they do have all these different rooms and all these different sections to cater to different types of music and interests. They have like an absinthe bar for people who are into absinthe. They have this like big main dance floor that like they play a lot of like industrial and EBM. They had a patio where they're playing maybe like some more old school music. They have a bunch of different rooms where they cater to different groups, but it's an alternative club. And if someone wants to have a goth night in Tampa, they could probably like reserve like the dungeon or another room at the castle to be able to put on a goth night. So it's that is one venue that like found a really creative workaround to be able to keep themselves financially viable, get people into the door, but still give everyone what they want without alienating anybody.
More questions?
Yeah, I'm looking through some of them right now.
I just saw a good one.
A recent comment.
Let's see.
From Anthony. Anthony Scott says, Kelly, what do you think about clubs that advertise as goth and play the same bands and nothing new? So, Anthony, I assume you mean like clubs, like goth clubs that play just like the old school, like classic goth music, but don't play any of the newer goth artists, which that's a common problem. There are a lot of like goth nights that luckily we do have enough nights that like play newer music that, I feel like I can get a good variety. But I do hear people complain about that a lot, that they have a lot of clubs where they're just playing the classic stuff. And honestly, I don't know if it's necessarily the DJ's choice in the matter. A lot of times DJs are under pressure to fill the dance floor and keep people dancing. And sometimes those old hits are what get the most people on the dance floor, and they're kind of like boxed into that. I would love to see more clubs playing newer music, because there was a goth event I went to this, or later in 2019 around here, where I requested She Passed Away, and the DJ didn't have She Passed Away. It was all like older stuff, which it was still a good set, and I still like all that older music, but it's like, I've heard, how many times in my life have I heard, This Corrosion, or, Stigmata Martyr, or whatever. Like, I really want to hear some of these like newer artists. And I don't know. I think there's a place for that. I think if you're going to play only like classic rock music, maybe like it'd be good to advertise as a classic goth night. And I've seen DJs do that. They'll advertise like a Batcave night where we're playing like classic 80s goth stuff, and then people come having like an accurate expectation of what's going to be played. So I don't know if that answers the question. Do anyone else have like thoughts on that?
I mean, what can I say? There's this nightclub that plays the same music over and over again every Saturday in downtown Orlando. But people still go there, and people still have fun there. It's been decades of Saturday night, that kind of dark way Saturday night, and you will always listen to David Bowie and the same songs every night. But at the same time, I mean, people still go.
Yeah.
Wish, that, go ahead. Yeah.
I was gonna ask Jonathan. Do you see that in New York, like these club nights where they play like mostly just like classic like music from like the 80s or like older music, but don't really like play newer stuff?
So there is a night here where it is unique in that the downstairs is a harsh EBM sort of night. It is very front 242, leather strip, Neubauten, etc. But then when you go upstairs, it is an 80s night. And it's really the only club. It's Pyramid Club. It's here in New York, and it's in Soho, and it's it's been around forever. It's really I haven't been able to go obviously we haven't been able to go anywhere for a while, but it is a really, really fun, and the night is called DEF CON. It's in the basement, and it's, like I said, it's a total EBM night, but I think that there is, it's the classics. And if you look at different DJs in this area, I would think to people like Patrick, who he has been a goth DJ within the city for years, and he lives in New Jersey, but he's always lived in Jersey City. But he is one of the preeminent sort of New York City goth DJs, and his tastes, even though he's actually I think he's a little bit older than me, he's always looking for new music, and he will play the classics, but he's actually focused on playing new music. That's actually been a really big thing for him, playing new music and getting new bands out there. Bands like Twin Tribes, he played my friend's band Tan, things like that. So he's old school, all hell, but he will play new music, and I think there is that, and I think that it's as elder goths, as it were, we have to realize that kids coming up in this are not necessarily as associated. There are kids that don't even know who Sisters of Mercy are, but like that's as hard as it is to believe, it's the thing. There are people that don't know Sisters of Mercy or even that familiar with the Depeche Mode song, and I know it's like hard for us to think about, but it's a reality. And how do you expose them to those things, but also incorporate what they're doing? I don't want to be stagnant, and I don't want to be justified in where I am right now, and I want to keep finding new music and keep making new music and keep learning new music. And I think that's really the most important thing. But
Oh,
Jonathan, you kind of cut out there. So, Caroline. Oh, go ahead, Jonathan. Yeah, we're getting a bad reception.
And his so
And there he goes. Okay.
He'll be back in a minute, I'm sure. So Caroline said, well, I've mostly listened to modern stuff the past couple of years. We want old school played at our local club night because we haven't had a night or scene in over a decade. No, I think it's good to play the classics at the club, but I do think it's tough when it's all one or the other. If someone's playing all new music or all old music, there's going to be people who are missing out on something. So whether it's like Jonathan brought up about, maybe younger people who haven't been exposed to that older music before and it's new music to them, having some classics in there is good for people like that. And I think that having like newer music is good for maybe the people who haven't been keeping on top of the new music as much. I mean, I think it is good to have both the old and new stuff. And Jonathan's back. Jonathan, you got a question in the chat. Ronnie asks, do you remember the Bank? I assume that's a New York club. Oh, and Jonathan is.
I do not remember the Bank. I'm sorry, Ronnie.
All right. So looking through the chat here. Black Currant and Wormwood. I don't think it's an issue of new versus old as much as it is about variety. I've seen some great sets with a lot of old or new stuff because they didn't play the obvious choices. Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think it's good to have variety. And you know what? I think experienced DJs know how to create a good cadence with their set list too, where maybe they kind of like start off the night a little more chill, like when you first, if you're one of the first people at the club, or if your like club night starts at 8 and you like show up right at 8 or 10 or whenever it starts, there's usually like people standing to the sides. People aren't on the dance floor yet. They're getting their drinks. They're not really loosened up yet. And then you slowly see more and more people get onto the dance floor. So like, I think like more experienced DJs do know how to create like a good cadence with their set list of like kind of having a good flow of dancing and kind of restful periods and kind of like getting like drawing people out onto the dance floor and then kind of winding down the night with the music that they pick.
Yeah, I think it's strategy.
Yeah.
I've seen this, right? What they called, old members or old goths going to nightclubs, right? And the DJ plays like, for example, an old song, a classic, and then they play a new band with a similar influences, and I've seen them shazam right away, to gather more information about the new music, which is similar to the ones I used to hear. So it's a great balance and strategy to make them to acknowledge that the music is not dead. Actually, there are young people who are being inspired by the classics, and they are creating new stuff. And this kind of DJs usually make a balance. They divide the set in genres, and they mix the old and new music, and that's the way they figure it out.
Yeah, a perfect word for that too, kind of like crescendo, their set list.
Yeah.
And about like having that like good cadence going. So it looks like Secret Society of Goths wanted to give a quick shout out to Rose Garden Funeral Party. They're like a newer, they're a more recent band. They're down in Texas. They're kind of like in the Dallas Fort Worth area. So they're a great band. That was a good shout out. So just wanted to show that one on screen because I think they deserve the love. So looking at so Two Broke Goth said it's not popular in the scene yet, but we have a DJ that plays Witch House, and it actually works as good background music. I actually don't know much about Witch House, so I can't really speak to that. I don't know Witch House. Like, is it like industrial where it's like bits and pieces of different stuff like kind of put together, or?
I will describe it like a trap.
I know actually. My wife.
Nope.
Oh, not again.
I'm
Yeah,
back.
Okay.
I know a lot about Witch House. My wife was
okay.
living with one of the preeminent sort of Witch House bands coming out of Greenpoint at the time, or Brooklyn at the time, called Creep, with Lauren Bird and Lauren Flax. It's basically techno. It's just dark techno. There was White Ring, which was, and this is tragic, but the vocalist of that band died this past year. But it was a very sort of it's hard to explain except that it's techno, but it's industrial at the same time. But it's also shoegaze. It's more shoegaze and techno than it is anything else. That's what Witch House is.
Yeah, so it sounds like kind of like a more experimental mix of some like I knew there was like some electronic, like I had an idea of that it's like kind of like a mix of a couple different things. So yeah, that's interesting.
Cemetery Confessions just commented, "Which house is the hipster of goth?" Thanks, Daniel.
No.
Come on.
I'm gonna text the count.
I don't know if that's offensive or a compliment. I don't know at this point.
It's not. Witch House was. It had a lot of opportunity. I thought some of the other things that I was doing were some of the things.
We're losing you again, Jonathan. Two Broke Goths Industrial, that's a new one to me. I don't mean that Witch House is industrial. I'm not saying that Witch House is industrial, but I meant like in the way that like industrial is like a bunch of things kind of like chopped up and like kind of stitched together. I was like wondering if like Witch House was kind of like a, like kind of cut and stitch sort of a music genre in that way. Oh, and you're back.
Yeah.
Hello.
I was just gonna. Very, very brief. I think it's kind of dumb.
All right, so Blackcurrant and Wormwood. I love being the early bird. They play the best stuff then. I agree. I like a lot of the stuff that gets played early on in the night when I go out to the club. Well, it depends on the DJ, but for the club that we frequent the most often, Second Skin. The DJs are actually like the two founders from Play Alone Records, and then there's another DJ, and they always like pick really good stuff, and it's not always like goth or whatever, but they like pick some good classics. They pick some. That's when they'll play some stuff that is a little more outside the box, because people are just like funneling in and getting their first drinks and everything. So, or if we're like watching a live show organized by like Play Alone Records or another local promoter, sometimes they'll play like that kind of music in between bands. They'll just like, throw on some like more creative choices and tracks. All right. Looks like Jonathan's back.
Sorry. Everyone's watching Netflix because no one can leave the house. So.
I was going to say, did you remember to close BitTorrent?
Yeah, I have way too many.
Hey, it's okay. We have been having trouble with our internet, but I made sure before this stream, I told Jim, I was like, reset the router, like just preemptively reset the router before we get on the live stream.
Last time we were on Obscure Undead, it cut us off mid-sentence, and I had to like sprint upstairs, unplug it, plug it back in, and wait like 15 minutes while explaining to them what happened in the live chat. So we've
I was on it.
I'm surprised that my phone is working and I'm still live and I don't have any problems with the reception, even in the bus. I'm really surprised. I appreciate this live stream.
Yeah, it seems to be working out all right. Yeah, that was I was on one of the Obscure Undead live streams. I think that was last week or the week before, and that was when our internet cut out right as I was saying something or something like that, and I had to wait like a good 15 minutes to jump back on the stream. So yeah, everyone's doing the best they can. I see that right now with everyone being at home throughout the workday. I'll see in our like Slack chat for work, people will be like, internet went down, be back online shortly. Internet should be a public utility.
Yes.
Cemetery Confession says Jim had to stop streaming my cam show. You pledged on OnlyFans?
Yeah. If you had a setting to like 420p, it wouldn't be a problem, but we can't do both at once as it is.
Right. Caroline says that she's going to be on the next Obscure Undead stream. So
nice.
Yay! I'll definitely be tuning in. Oh, that brings up something I forgot to say at the beginning that I wanted to let everyone know. This live stream is in lieu of my regular upload for Thursday. I just decided that today would be a better day to do this than Thursday because there's a couple goth YouTubers who tend to do live streams on Thursdays. I like to tune into those. I'm sure some of you like to as well. I like to watch the Obscure Undead streams, and there's a couple other goth YouTubers who sometimes stream on Thursdays as well. So I decided that Monday would be a good day. I didn't see as many like virtual events pop up for today.
Hi. Hello, welcome back.
So there's a lot of discussion on Witch House in here.
I know nothing about Witch House. I wish I could contribute anything. I know they have those hats. That's the only thing I know about Witch House.
Yeah, I don't really know much about Witch House. I see people complain about it. Like, it's one of those hot button issues, like with goth stuff, I see the same topics being debated online. The same topics seem to be like sore topics that people will argue back and forth over. And I'm just like, I don't care. I don't have the time of day to argue about Witch House or any of this other stuff. Like, I really... maybe I should check out some Witch House. Maybe it's, people in the chat are saying like good things about Witch House. So Dry Shy asks hats. Are you talking about like witch hats? Like do people?
Yeah, like they have like wide brim hats, but they're a little bit more modernized. I don't know. That's like the clickbaity pictures that show up on Witch House videos. I see. I know nothing about it. I see thumbnails. I don't.
So Brandon Taylor asked, Kelly, could you give us a rundown of other goth YouTubers live streaming on Thursday? Sure. The only one I know of for sure right now is Obscura Undead. If you go to the Obscura Undead channel for this week. But I know I've seen Angela Benedict do occasional live streams here and there. Sometimes those are on Thursdays. I think last Thursday she did one. And the Thursday live streams for Obscura Undead are hosted by Skullgirdle RIP. So that's if you want to see like a bunch of like goth YouTubers or content creators or goth personalities like on one live stream, that Obscura Undead stream, they do it every Thursday. And there are a few other YouTubers who I don't think they have like a regular streaming schedule. They just like sometimes will occasionally pop onto a live stream or like go live. Maybe they'll decide the day before or day of that they're going to go live. And I think a lot of content creators are doing a lot more live streams and virtual events and things like that since everyone's stuck at home right now. So hopefully that answers the question. Actually, I'll type in chat Obscura Undead. That's how you spell it. And yeah, if you search that, actually, and if you're not already subscribed to them on my YouTube channel, if you go to like the homepage for my YouTube channel, there's featured channels, and Obscura Undead is featured under the featured channels on my homepage.
Right. Yeah.
And JoJo and I both write articles for the Obscura Undead website. So that's obscuraundead.com.
Yes, a lot of opportunities to speak with a lot of artists. Actually, I started especially giving ode and promotion to certain independent bands in the South American and especially Hispanic. I started like an article called Death Rock is Undead, talking about the Death Rock revival, especially with Los Desterrados, which is a band that makes great music. Two guys, actually, and they are awesome. Also, I figured out that there's a huge community of death rock in Brazil. That
it's big down there.
Yeah, and they are awesome. They are very humble, especially in I don't know. Let's see how it goes because maybe Obscura Undead will go in Spanish, hopefully, and I will help a lot with that because it seems that there's a whole community that wants to go out there and say, "Hey, I'm here," and we need the voices and we need the people to create these lines and settings. So hopefully, yeah, big things coming up.
Yeah, it would be cool if like, or you could even like when you write articles, you could write it in both English and Spanish. Like you could have like the Spanish article and the English article, or that'd be cool. I don't speak Spanish, so but there's a huge goth community in Mexico City, and and all kinds of there's a huge like Spanish speaking goth community, and goth is huge in Spain too. There's like so much great like post punk that has come out of Spain. So yeah, there's a big Spanish speaking goth community. I would say
Madrileña.
Yeah, out of or next to English, I would say Spanish is the second largest language in my music library. I don't understand any of it, but it's really good music. Like I have a lot of favorite like goth death rock bands that are in Spanish, or like post-punk bands that are in Spanish. I would say that's the second largest language. Then maybe German. I don't know if it's German. I would say I have a lot of like English and Spanish goth music, and then I have like a few other languages in the mix. Like I listen to some German bands, some Russian bands,
Russian bands.
Yeah, French bands too.
It sounds great.
Yeah.
So one thing I brought up, Charlotte Lilly asked, can you give some of your favorite band suggestions for a baby bat bored at home? So we could probably pass that around pretty briefly and easily.
Yeah, and I think it's really going to depend on what your existing taste in music is, because there's a lot of variety. Actually, I have a very good list of my favorite bands up on my website, and it's grouped by category. I'm going to drop the link to this in the chat. So that's a list of some of my favorite bands. So what I would suggest doing is to listen to, like, maybe grab one band from each category, like just pick one that's their name sounds interesting to you or something like that. One from each category, listen to it, figure out what sound or category you like best, and then maybe you explore more bands in that category based on like which one was your favorite. So like if a death rock band was your favorite out of the ones that you sampled, then maybe go back and listen to some more of the death rock bands, or if or if a post-punk band, or goth rock band. So that's how I would suggest for beginners, just because I think different people are going to have different tastes when it comes to like the style of goth music that they're into. And I think it might be like a mistake if I like recommended just like some of the like old classic bands, because not everyone likes that sound. So yeah, that would be my suggestion, is get a sampling of a few different like subgenres. But I don't know, Jonathan, do you have any goth bands you'd like to recommend? We got a beginner in the chat who's looking for recommendations.
Yes, and I apologize for my technological difficulties coming up. I would say that Asylum Party is a very underrated and under-listened to post-punk dark wave, really, really good band and they're super accessible. I would also say from a contemporary perspective, I would say that if you're into more hard industrial sort of music, my friend Dominic, that it runs both Hospital Records and is the founding member of Purient and Vatican Shadow. Both Purient and Vatican Shadow are very, very hard techno. And then if you're looking for something a little lighter, another close friend of mine who lives in Nashville is in a band called Tan, and they do really, really strong Italo disco. And then, unfortunately, now that they've broken up, but there was a band called Neurosis. They're from Columbus, Ohio, but they were a proper death rock band that was really, really rad. And their records are still worth checking out.
Jim, do you have any favorites that you want to recommend?
So what I've been listening to recently, everybody's been clamoring in the chat over Drab Majesty, and I already said it there. I've been listening to just a ton of Drab Majesty lately, just going up and down through their albums as I'm doing my work. They are, if I'm going to actually plug them, they are from California, I believe. And
Drab Majesty from New York? I don't know. I might have that wrong.
I have no clue.
They're from LA and they're on Deist. So yeah, I know those dudes.
Oh, wow. The Molchat Doma, been listening to a ton of Molchat Doma.
Oh yeah, Molchat Doma is so good.
They're great. They were one of the ones I heard them. Their music was like showing up in memes and stuff first, and I was like, "This is awesome! What, this is." And then I checked, and I'm like, "Oh, this is like I'd heard their name around a bit." So they seem to be having a kind of groundswell coming up. And just as another one I threw in because it was one I had close to my desk, we saw an act. It was probably around October, I believe, called Ships in the Night. And I got her album Myrialogs, which I've been listening to. That's kind of like an ambient, ethereal, dark electronic album.
I would say I would call her almost like an ethereal synthwave kind of band.
Yeah,
maybe I feel like a lot of people would probably maybe call her more goth adjacent, but
these aren't like strictly goth, this, that, or the other thing. These
are all bands you would hear in a goth club, though. You would hear all of these.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
But yeah, Ships in the Night's good. Actually, if you prefer to, like, if just all this music sounds like overwhelming, like if it's just an overwhelming amount of music to take in, I also post a song of the day on my Facebook page. So every day at 4 p.m. Eastern, I have like a bunch of stuff scheduled. So a different song goes up every day. So I'll drop the link to that as well. And I do know some people who have told me that they follow the Facebook page and they just every day when they see it come across their feed, they listen to that song of the day. If they like it, they add it to a playlist. If not, they, wait for the next day's song. So that's another, I try to have like a few different resources out there so people can go about it like with different approaches. So I'm looking, and there's other suggestions in the chat. Opera du Nuit, that's like a cold wave band, good one. I probably butchered that pronunciation, which is terrible because I actually speak a little French. The Ire, the Ire's so good. We got to see the Ire live at Skullfest last summer. They put on a really good performance. They opened up for Rick Agnew Band. She Passed Away. My favorite album of 2019 was the new She Passed Away album. Disco.
That's why I didn't bring them up. I didn't want to hammer on too much about them. They're great. Yeah, we love them.
There was a London After Midnight suggestion from Two Broke Goss. So yeah, lots of stuff. We got a couple Levin and Hannah over suggestions. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff was it Lily who asked that? Or Charlotte Lily. Okay, so Charlotte Lily, a lot of recommendations there for you to work off of. Hopefully you find some bands that you like. And it looks like there's other suggestions in the chat there for you. So let's see. There was a Twin Tribes shout out. Of course, Twin Tribes is great too.
Oh yeah.
And we saw them live and reviewed their new album actually. Let's see here. So lots of band recommendations in the mix. Looks like JoJo got cut off from us. We're approaching about 2 hours here, or it's almost 9. So I think we can call this stream a wrap. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining the stream. Nice to talk to you again, and stay safe out there in New York.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, everyone definitely stay safe, and it's a weird time, but it's also a dark time. So hopefully a lot of really good music comes out of it.
Yeah, that one of the few silver linings to all this. Maybe we'll get some good music. So thanks again, Jonathan.
Good night, everyone. Take care and be safe.
Good night. And Jim, I'll see you in a minute here, but thank you for co-hosting and for moderating the stream.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thanks, JoJo, publicly, even though you're gone.
Yes,
thanks for joining us and helping out. That was great.
Thank you to JoJo for joining the stream and for also contributing. So just me now. I just have a few quick sign-off messages here. Thank you again to my guests for coming on tonight and for helping to make my first live stream a success. We had a few issues with the internet connection, but for the most part, nothing too catastrophic happened. Thank you to everyone for watching this stream. If you enjoyed this live broadcast and want to support the channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/cadaverkelly. There is only one tier on my Patreon, and it is name your own price, starting as low as $1 a month. With that comes access to my Discord server, where we have a nice little community of folks who share a passion for music and alternative subcultures. You will also get early ad-free access to my videos and your name listed in my video credits. All proceeds from Patreon, Super Chats, and YouTube ads goes towards covering operating costs of the channel. I would like to thank my patrons for the month of March, as this stream was brought to you in part by them. Thank you to Jay and Turnus, Lewis Krause, Oliver H., Dry as Shy, Ava, Lilith, Non-Servium, Kevin Jackson, Elin, Reese B., Sean Demand. Thank you all. And thank you to Tragic Age, who is a new patron of mine as of April. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and now Twitter as well. My handle or URL username is Cadaver Kelly on all of those. So thank you, everyone in the chat, for coming and contributing. Dry, Two Broke Goths, Secret Society of Goths. Thank you to everyone who is a moderator, too. A few of you are moderators. Caroline, Secret Society of Goths. Thank you to everyone who came, who commented. This was hopefully a successful first stream, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks so much. Stay safe. Have a great night.